Thank you everyone again, and welcome back to the USAID Asia Counter Trafficking In-Person Summit from Evidence to Action, hosted by Winrock International. My name is Hermes, and I will be your technical facilitator today alongside my colleague Em to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled Perspectives on Seafood Slavery. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we want to cover a few technical features available for you today. We're using Zoom meetings to enable as much interactivity as possible. Throughout the summit and throughout the session. Give me just a moment to enable interpretation here to make sure that all of our interpreters are able to allow those audio sessions to happen. Okay. So for those of you who do desire language interpretation today, you can now go ahead and select a language channel at the bottom of your screen by selecting the interpretation button at the bottom and selecting the language that you would like to listen to, whether that is Burmese, Khmer, or Thai. Your participation via chat is highly encouraged, and our team will work to acknowledge and address as many questions, comments as we can throughout today's session. To help us acknowledge your questions and inputs, please rename yourself to your name and organization by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom window, hovering your mouse over your name, clicking more, and then clicking rename. This meeting will be recorded, and please keep your camera off unless you are invited to speak in order to help everyone have a smooth connection today. Continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams and spark further conversations on social media using the hashtags WinrockE2A and hashtag Evidence to Action. Once again, you are at the session titled Perspectives on Seafood Slavery. We are now ready to get started, so I will hand over the floor to Dr. Beck Strotting, Executive Director of La Trobe Asia. Beck, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's terrific to be here. Hello and welcome to this panel session on perspectives on seafood slavery. My name is Beck Strotting and I'm from La Trobe University, and I will be chairing today's event. So seafood slavery has emerged as a growing concern for states, corporations and the anti-trafficking sector. And dedicated responses have emerged, focusing on a range of different interventions in order to try and deal with this issue of trafficked fishes. It is terrific to have our panel here today to critically review some of these interventions, to identify ongoing gaps in addressing the problems and identifying areas where greater research efforts could be made. So just before we begin, we have created a multiple choice question for you. So please feel free to contribute your anonymous answer. And I can see the poll has just come up here. Of the following four options, which fishing fleet has come under the most criticism for seafood slavery? Is it A, China, B, Thailand, C, the United States of America, or D, Russia? Looking forward to seeing the responses to this poll question at the end of the session. So today, each of our panelists will have around 10 minutes to discuss their topic before we move on to Q&A, which will be for around 30 minutes. So before we begin, please allow me to introduce our expert panel. So we have three presenters today. Our first presenter is Jong Chul, or JC Kim, from Advocates for Public Interest Law, who's zooming in from South Korea today. Our second speaker will be Patricia Kailola from Pacific Dialogues in Fiji. So welcome, Patricia. And our third speaker will be Bobby Anwar Ma'arif from the Indonesian Migrant Workers Union, or SBMI, from Indonesia. So welcome, Bobby. We will also have a discussant, Dr. Sally Yeh from La Trobe University in Australia. Will be speaking for 10 minutes as well. We also have our three facilitators, Wayne Palmer from Monash University, Australia, Christina Stringer from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and Sunil Rao from La Trobe University, Australia. So let's get into it. I might hand over the floor to JC to start us off. Thank you, JC.
Okay. Thank you, Beck, for a wonderful introduction. I'm grateful to participate in this workshop as a panelist. I'd like to share um, my finding of what happened to a Chinese fishing vessel, Longsing 629, operating waters near Samoa between 2019 and 2020. I had opportunities to interview Indonesian fishers who were working in Longsing 629 while they were in quarantine in Korea for 14 days before going back to their country. Through the interview, I found that they experienced serious human rights violations equivalent to human trafficking. They worked more than 18 hours a day without rest for 13 months, and their monthly wages on their contract ranged between 300 and 450 US dollars depending on the cruise. The half of them were withheld by recruitment agencies for placement fee and security deposit, and the rest of wages were rarely paid. So there is a fisher who got paid only 120 US dollars for whole 13 months. And verbal abuse is everyday experience, and some of crews were physically assaulted. And there is also discrimination. For instance, Longsing has, of course, its toilets, but Indonesian crews were not allowed to use any of them. While Chinese crews drank fresh water, Indonesian crews were given only poorly filtered seawater. That's why the interviewed Indonesian crews alleged that the drinking poorly filtered seawater was the cause of sickness of deceased victim. Despite of exploitation, discrimination, and abuses, they could not leave the vessel because there are methods employed to tie them at sea. Passport retention, 13-month sailing without any port call, and security deposit are some of examples of the method. Longsing 629 is a tuna longliner, but they targeted shark with specially designed fishing gear for several months. After finning, they threw all the bodies of shark to the sea, and they dry them before putting them in the boxes of refrigerator. When interviewed, Indonesian fishers um, left Longsing 629 to be transferred to another vessel heading to Korea. They found 18 boxes full of shark's fin, with each weighing 45 kilograms, which means that Longxing 629 collected at least a ton of shark's fin. And the photos shared by the Indonesian crews show that they also caught protected species like scalloped hammerhead shark and false killer whale. These practices are relating to human trafficking and IUU fishing. I don't believe it is unique to Longxing 629. These have been happening to other fishing vessels, including Korean ones. But Longxing 629 drew a lot of media attention. This is because 3 Indonesian co-workers died of unknown disease, and Chinese crews buried them at sea. On the contract, they were supposed to be cremated and returned to their families. But Longxing was hurrying to bury them at sea, maybe for fear of COVID-19 infection. But they were very slow to respond to the request by the deceased victim for medical treatment. Some of the deceased victim requested for more than a month for taking them to the hospital in Samoa. But the requests were denied and they were given a handful of unknown medicines every day. The point I paid a lot of attention is why they did not take them to the hospital. They might wanted to save gas by not going to port. But I believe they were afraid that the illegally collected shark's fin would be discovered by the inspection when they enter the port. This belief is based on the statement by interviewed Indonesian fishers that Longxing 629 was operating along with its sister vessel, 10 more sister vessels. And its sister vessel was catching sharks in the same manner. Whenever the sister vessels, went to the port, they transshipped the collected shark's fin by small boats from one vessel to another. I'd like to conclude my presentation by telling you about what kind of action I have taken to address the case. I filed an accusation against the fishing company, Chinese fishing company, to Korean authorities. Even though this happened, the crime happened in foreign flag vessel to Indonesian, but under the Korean Criminal Code, Korean authorities has universal jurisdiction over human trafficking crime. So I urged Korean government to engage in victims while they were staying in Korea. But unfortunately, the Korean investigation office, they did not engage very much. And recently, the prosecutor's office closed the case. I also collaborated with the Indonesian lawyer to bring the many agencies to the justice. And the three CEOs of 3 recruitment agency in Indonesia were arrested and indicted. And I also tried to get help from international environmental NGOs based in China to call for Chinese government intervention in the case. but it did not work very at all. And Chinese government, are denying what happened to Longxing. And I also engage in RFMO, which is WCPFC, who has the jurisdiction of this case, but this was not successful. And not only the member state, but also the NGOs, some of them were very reluctant to cooperate with us, maybe for the consideration of, like diplomatic consideration with China. But I hope the Longxing case would be discussed in the next, the annual meeting of WCPFC. And I'm preparing the complaint to UN special procedures. I'm confident that there are numerous Longxing-like fishing vessel involving in human trafficking and IU fishing. While I was working with the Indonesian fishers in Longxing, I kept asking myself this question: if the flag state does not want to regulate and monitor its vessel, and if the state of crew does not provide efficient protection to its national, how we can address, the human trafficking in IU fishing in this context. I hope this kind of question would be discussed in the workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, JC, for sharing your experiences. I'm sure that when we get to the Q&A section, we can unpack some of those barriers to prosecution that you mentioned in your presentation. But now we will turn to Patricia. Welcome, Patricia. You've got 10 minutes to talk about some of your experiences.
Okay, you can hear me now? Yes, okay. All right, thank you, JC, for your article. It concurs with what we find in the Pacific. For those others among you, I live in Fiji, and I'm a fishery scientist, but I've started to look at the men who work with the men who work on the vessels. And the ones that I work with mostly are from what we call squatter settlements or informal settlements. And these settlements are adjacent to the fish processing plants. And the main ones are people who are Solomon Islander descendants. So the Solomon Islanders were brought over 150 years ago, and they were given land, and these are their descendants. So a lot of these men feel that they're not as good as Fijians because they're mixed race, although actually Fijians are all mixed race from all around. We call them fruit salads over here. And many of them haven't been to high school, or they just haven't finished. We looked at the characteristics of human trafficking, and with the help of others, I decided it didn't really occur per se here, but there are other elements in the fishery, that is, that there are other elements that are what you call deception in the act of recruitment, and also with fraud. So fraud, general dishonesty, obtaining benefit from deception, providing false or misleading information, or abduction for the purpose of slavery. So common situations in the Pacific, and these are very common on nearly every vessel where we've talked to crew, especially from these settlements, or their wives or their mothers. They are failure to provide a signed contract to the employee, being forced to work excessive hours, arbitrary imposition of penalties. So if someone's asleep after 18 hours of work, and they get their wages cut. Lack of sufficient food, and also the dirty water that JC mentioned is fairly common. And we've heard that some of the companies complain that the Fijians eat too much. Well, the Fijians are bigger men than Asian people, and they do a lot of the hard work. So I think they're bound for that. And the poor accommodation, similarly, bed bugs, no mattress, no pillow. And also the companies say that the Pacific Islanders take up too much room on the vessels. Unsanitary, excuse me, conditions, toilet, shower, galley, being made to pay for extra food. So when they know they're going out on a trip, these men will go and buy like dried noodles or muesli bars or something, because the galley's shut for 12 hours from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m. and they're working overnight. And the companies will give them money to buy the food, but then they'll deduct it off their wages, right? That extra food. There's other things, of course, on a fishing vessel, you can't resign and walk home. Very unsafe conditions. And I was telling Sally and Christina some of these the other day, but one of the things that is not uncommon, when the gear gets caught around the rudder or the propeller, the men have to jump overboard and dive down without diving apparatus and unwind the cable and the wires from those instruments. In two instances, one man Viliami was washed overboard in a cyclone. It was at night time, and he and Charlie, the other fellow, looked back at the vessel, and the people on the vessel were busy pulling in all the equipment. And when they got all the equipment on board, they looked for the men. So the men were at sea for an hour in the darkness, hoping to be rescued. The other one was Inoki, and Inoki was transshipped. And how he was transshipped, he was put in one of those metal fish crates with buoys around the outside. His clothes were put in a plastic bag, his papers. He was given a torch and he was put over the side. That was at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 5 hours later, at 10 o'clock, the other vessel came along. So he's a very lucky man, actually, to be still alive. So that's how they transship. Sometimes they send them on bamboo rafts between vessels. Sometimes they just have to swim. So there were many things. Sometimes the men say that they're sometimes stabbed while they're sleeping. And quite often there's stories of people sneaking up with a chopper, and chopping their legs or their ankles. One of the other ones that is a new one is being compromised by being engaged in smuggling. So this is, they're always reporting they're being asked to move goods across from their fishing vessel onto a mothership or back the other way. So sorry if I'm taking too long. So if that happened to any of us, we'd raise merry hell when we got to shore, but these men don't, because they accept that that's just how it is. They are simple men with a strong Christian work ethic, and they believe they're less worthy than other people because they haven't finished school, they're mixed race. They're worried about being blacklisted, and they do not know their rights. So that's a major one, not knowing their rights. I also want to mention the Maritime Labour Convention. The Maritime Labour Convention in its preamble says that it looks after seafarers and also working in commercial or industrial vessels, but it does not cover fishing vessels. I've had that clarification from ILO. It's the C188 Working Fishing Conventions, and there are only 14 countries who've signed that. None of them are Pacific countries, Pacific nations, and none of them are Pacific Rim countries, which means that people working in the Pacific are not protected by any international convention. So ask yourself, why would any nation whose vessels are doing very nicely, thank you, are going to bother signing on to the C188? They're not going to. So we all seen this, and inside of all the reports that come out in media and in publications, nothing happens. The vessels keep sailing and they keep fishing and the abuse carrying on. So the reasons for this are money, okay, the value of the fishery, geopolitical influence, dependence on access fees by the countries to fish in your ENZs, and governments don't want to upset the industry on which so much income depends. Governments would rather throw their nationals under a bus, as we'd say in Australia, than defend their nationals' rights, because after all, they are simply and most simple and mostly undereducated men working on a fishing vessel gives them a job. That's the attitude. Oh, they got a job, right? I was going to quote some parts from an article, but I could send that article to you. It's saying one fellow, it was published in 2010, one fellow's writing from a fishing boat, and he's saying just at the end, I would kindly ask our governments, he says, our governments boast about all the Pacific Islanders on the vessels, but not one of them has come to check to see what actually happens on the vessels, right? I kindly ask our government's appropriate authorities to closely monitor the activities of the licensed fishing vessels and the circumstances. We would rather struggle for the benefit of our own people and our nations than work as slaves to others who treat us like dirt in our own Pacific Sea. So finally, I've got some recommendations. JC, you asked for suggestions and I've put quite a few together here. So if you bear with me, there's just a dozen, I think. Firstly, this is Pacific Islands, so it could cover everyone. Governments should take ownership of the fishery as it operates in their EEZs. So they give out access, they get fees, they give permission for these vessels to operate in their EEZs, manned by their people. So they should take ownership of the vessels. So they should ensure the application of workers' rights. Only men with basic safety certificates should be allowed to be employed. So sea safety, firefighting, rescue and first aid is a basic course. Governments should subsidise that training. The agents, the fishing agents, should be licensed by government. So I know the ones in Indonesia, some of them were and some of them weren't licensed, but the license period should be 1 year only. And there should be a limit of 2 agents per nation. So here in Fiji, we've got quite a number, own door fronts and things like that. You've all seen it. The crewmen should be unionised. They attempted that here in Fiji about 15 years ago. And of course, the men got sacked and the people, that was the end of the union, but it should be allowed to happen. The Maritime Labour Convention should consider incorporating the C188 convention within it, because the MLC is accepted globally. Starting off a new convention isn't going to cut any ice. It's just would be just another chapter or a few caveats or a few changes to cover the men working on fishing vessels. And I understand the International Transport Workers Federation is now looking at fishing vessel people. Standard crew contracts should be administered by or should be part of the license, like in our area by the Foreign Fisheries Agency or the Commission. They should be the standard one and they should be checked. The Pacific Island countries, this is again, I'm in the Pacific, should domesticate or amend their maritime laws so that they're allowed to inspect all fishing vessels every time they come to port. In Fiji, the Fiji Maritime Authority is only allowed to inspect the flagged vessels. So it can't inspect ones that just come in to offload their catch. Information on the bad guy vessels, like this Zongjing, should be circulated to all governments, government authorities, and to fishing vessel officials themselves each month, along with tracking details like Global Fishing Watch and some of these other ones, vessel information, along with the quantity of fish they have or unloaded and so on. And we've got bad examples. One that I keep my eye on a lot is the Tunago 61. And another one is the Yi, which has just recently changed its name. And just lastly, bear with me, government authorities should be more active in monitoring fleets and crew and give awareness to the communities. Here in Fiji, Labor people haven't even gone to the settlements. So I go as an individual and I enlist a few people like a retired merchant captain and so on, and we talk with the men, but the government keeps well away. Punitive action should be taken against any vessel and company where there is evidence of human rights abuse. And that should be, a good one would be banning it from the fishery for set periods of time. So some of you are aware of the WinFar 636 issue. Kiribati kept that vessel tied up for 7 months, and that was a huge penalty to that company. And the same sort of thing should be applied for crew. The last two ones, fishing vessels should take up comprehensive insurance for personnel. At the moment, they only cover the vessel. They don't cover the crew. And the last one is the Maritime MSC, Marine Stewardship Council, should be held to account on its forced labour statements. Because those forced labour, like we don't have any forced labour, they get them from the companies. They don't go and talk to the men. They just get the company. Everyone ticks the boxes. No one ever looks. So lastly, I repeat what I said at the beginning. I hope I said it at the beginning. Without crew, fish can't be landed. That should be up there in flashing lights to look after your crew. And if these things, the litany that I've said, that JC said, that maybe other speakers are going to say, if that is allowed to happen in the tuna fishery now, how can anyone say with confidence that seafood is not tainted by slavery? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Patricia. You have given us a lot to think about. 12 recommendations in a 10-minute presentation is a phenomenal effort. So I'm sure we'll try and unpack some of these in the Q&A as well. But our third speaker is Bobby. Bobby will be speaking, presenting in Indonesian, and Wayne will be translating. So the floor is yours, Bobby.
Silakan Pak Bobby, di unmute aja.
Baik, terima kasih. Saya akan menyampaikan laporan SBMI bekerja sama dengan Greenpeace Indonesia di dalam mendalami kasus-kasus ABK perikanan. Jadi, Serikat Buruh Migran Indonesia sudah melaksanakan kegiatan penanganan kasus sejak tahun 2014. Kami sudah menangani lebih dari 300 kasus ABK. Mereka memang tidak terdata di pemerintah karena direkrut oleh banyak perusahaan-perusahaan ilegal yang menempatkan para ABK ke luar negeri. Kebanyakan mereka ditempatkan ke negara-negara kapal berbendera Taiwan dan China. Dari 300 tersebut, kami memang sangat kesulitan untuk mendapatkan dokumen-dokumennya, sehingga kami menyeleksi satu persatu di antara mereka yang mempunyai kelengkapan dokumen. Misalnya dokumen paspor, seaman book, basic safety training, kemudian kontrak, dan dokumen-dokumen lainnya yang dimiliki oleh para ABK. Jumlahnya sangat sedikit sekali yang memiliki kelengkapan dokumen, hanya 34 ABK. Selain dari itu, kebanyakan ABK tidak memiliki dokumen, tidak memegang dokumen. Nah, kemudian kami mewawancarai mereka dengan menggunakan indikator kerja paksa ILO. Dari temuan tersebut, kami banyak mendapatkan informasi bahwa memang terjadi praktek kerja paksa, dan indikator-indikator yang kami temukan adalah misalnya pelanggaran nomor 1, ada 11 indikator kerja paksa ILO, dan yang terjadi pada ABK itu kebanyakan memang pada pelanggaran nomor 2, kemudian nomor 6, nomor 7, nomor 8, dan nomor 11, yaitu pelanggaran nomor 2 yaitu
I think we have a technical issue on the side. Wayne, do you think that you could let Bobby know that he's muted?
Pak Bobby, silakan di-unmute.
sendiri. Oh, mohon maaf. Jadi ada pelanggaran nomor nomor 2 sampai 11 itu paling banyak ya. Nah, kemudian kami juga menemukan bahwa dari mereka ada perusahaan-perusahaan yang melakukan perekrutan, yang kebanyakan perusahaan ini berbasis di Jawa Tengah, Pulau Jawa, Jawa Tengah. Nah, ada beberapa perusahaan-perusahaan besar yang melakukan perekrutan ABK secara ilegal. Perusahaan-perusahaan ini antara lain adalah Puncak Jaya Samudra, negara tujuan penempatannya itu China dan Taiwan, yang beroperasi di Fiji, Hawaii, Afrika Selatan, Trinidad, Mauritius, Tonga, Samoa, Amerika. Ini negara pencarian ikan. Nah, kemudian kasus-kasus para ABK ini ditempatkan ke beberapa kapal China, yaitu misalnya Fuyuanyu nomor 54. Kemudian Fuyuanyu nomor 55. Kemudian Fuyuanyu nomor 56, Hanrong nomor 353, kemudian Hantong 1115 dan Hantong 112. Kemudian Lurong Yuan Yu nomor 30 dan Zongda nomor 2. Ada 6 perusahaan di Indonesia, terus kemudian ada 13 kapal-kapal China yang paling besar melakukan perbudakan di tengah kapal. Nanti dokumennya akan kami share kepada semua. Nah, hal ini terjadi kenapa? Karena memang di Indonesia hingga saat ini sedang memperbaiki tata kelola penempatan ABK. Undang-Undang Nomor 18 Tahun 2017 sudah mengatur bahwa salah satu pekerja migran itu adalah ABK. Nah, kemudian undang-undang ini mengatur aturan turunannya atau aturan pelaksananya. Itu harus selesai dalam tempo 2 tahun, yaitu sampai 22 November 2019, namun hingga saat ini aturan pelaksananya itu belum terbit, sehingga carut-marut atau persoalan-persoalan yang timbul itu masih sangat banyak terjadi. Nah, informasi yang terakhir yang kami dapatkan beberapa hari kemarin, itu ada pemulangan sekitar 151 ABK yang bekerja di kapal berbendera China, dan kemudian ada 2 yang meninggal dunia. Nah, ini semua terjadi karena memang persoalan kebijakan di dalam negeri, kemudian ini juga terjadi karena banyaknya perusahaan-perusahaan yang ilegal itu dapat melakukan perekrutan ke negara-negara yang menjadi tujuan para ABK. Di dalam hal penanganan kasus, kami banyak melibatkan beberapa institusi pemerintah, misalnya Badan Pelindungan Pekerja Migran Indonesia, kemudian Kementerian Ketenagakerjaan, kemudian Kementerian Perhubungan, kemudian Kementerian Luar Negeri. Tapi karena memang regulasi atau aturan pelaksananya belum terbit, sehingga sampai saat ini kami masih banyak menemukan kendala-kendala di lapangan. Salah satu yang membuat shock menjadi shock terapi bagi perusahaan-perusahaan ilegal itu, kami menggunakannya dengan mempidanakan dengan undang-undang tindak pidana perdagangan orang atau undang-undang trafficking. Kami berterima kasih sekali kepada TV Korea yang sudah mempublish ya, sehingga viral di Indonesia, karena sebelum terjadi peristiwa pelarungan di kapal Longsing itu, kami sangat kesulitan sekali untuk membuat viral berita-berita tentang ABK, karena waktu itu ini isunya belum populis. Nah, saat ini kami sudah mulai punya banyak energi untuk melakukan tekanan kepada pemerintah, namun pada saat ini kami juga mengalami kendala di dalam mengawal kebijakannya, karena ada undang-undang Omnibus Law yang diterbitkan oleh pemerintah. Nah, ini yang masih membuat kita bertanya-tanya, karena mekanisme perizinan itu ada di tangan pemerintah pusat, dan pemerintah pusat itu artinya adalah presiden yang dibantu oleh wakil presiden dan menteri. Nah, ini hampir sama situasinya dengan sebelum adanya Undang-Undang Nomor 18 Tahun 2017 yang perizinan itu ada di beberapa kementerian, seperti Kementerian Ketenagakerjaan, Kementerian Perhubungan, dan pemerintah daerah. Nah, ini yang membuat kekacauan di dalam pelindungan ABK Indonesia. Nanti kami akan share ya report ini kepada kawan-kawan semuanya. Beberapa nama perusahaan lain, misalnya Cincun nomor 12. Ini perusahaan-perusahaan ini melakukan penahanan gaji kepada ABK. Jadi gaji itu dibagi dalam 3 ya. Ada gaji yang menjadi jaminan kemudian ada gaji yang dibayar di atas kapal, kemudian ada gaji yang dikirimkan kepada keluarganya melalui agen. Nah, gaji-gaji ini yang paling membuat ABK merasa dirugikan adalah gaji yang menjadi jaminan. Jaminan ini harus jaminan ini baru bisa diterima oleh ABK ketika dia menyelesaikan kontraknya. Sementara kondisi kerjanya yang sangat berat, bekerja lebih dari 20 jam kerja, nah ini yang mengakibatkan para ABK mengalami sakit, kemudian kecelakaan kerja, bahkan hingga meninggal dunia. Nah, akhirnya uang jaminan tadi itu tidak diterimanya karena mereka harus break kontrak. Kontraknya selesai sebelum finish kontrak. Nah, memang di dalam menjalankan bisnisnya, para perusahaan rekrut ilegal ini mereka berani menjanjikan gaji yang besar, kemudian kondisi kerjanya yang baik, bonusnya tinggi, kemudian mereka juga menggunakan jeratan utang. Itu yang membuat para calon ABK itu tertarik untuk bekerja sebagai ABK di luar negeri, terutama di dua negara yang besar itu ya, yaitu China dan Taiwan. Nah, kemudian di laut itu banyak sekali peristiwa-peristiwa yang membuat mereka ini tidak bisa melakukan perlawanan terhadap misalnya kapten, karena mereka diintimidasi kayak gitu.
Thank you, Bobby. Wayne, are you happy to give us a quick translation of Bobby's presentation? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Bobby, for the presentation. I'm just going to give you a translation now of the main issues. Bobby said that the Indonesian Migrant Workers Union has been very grateful for cooperating with international partners. One of the recent reports and collaborations that they've had has been with Greenpeace Indonesia. Since 2004, SBMI has been working on these issues in Indonesia. Since then, they've found that there have been about 300 cases. Not all of the migrant fishers involved in those cases were recorded. Their departure wasn't recorded by government. And a problem there is with recruitment. Government doesn't know what is going on with recruitment of migrant fishers. Of the fishers who were involved in those cases, most were employed on fishing vessels that were flagged either in Taiwan or around China waters. Not all of the migrant fishers had complete sets of documents. It was very difficult for them when they were doing their research. They interviewed the migrant fishers who had been returned to Indonesia. But of all of those fishers, they only found that 34 of them had complete documents. And those complete documents include things like seaman book, passport, these kinds of documents. When they did the research, they used ILO indicators for forced labor, and they found that the most common indicators that the migrant fishers reported was deception, the retention of documents, and and abuse involved with the employment and also the living conditions. They found that there are 6 main manning agents in Indonesia that are involved in the recruitment of fishers migrant fishers who are trafficked. There are many more fishing vessels that these manning agents supply migrant fishers to. One of the major challenges that that SBMI and other observers face in Indonesia is that they're looking at a recruitment system that is basically unregulated. The government intended to create a uniform system, and the idea was to announce that system in November this month, but that is looking very unlikely. SBMI has coordinated quite a lot with government organizations in Indonesia, the main ones being the Ministry of Manpower, the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a technical agency to do with the recruitment and placement of Indonesian migrant workers. Once again, SBMI said that they're very grateful for collaboration. They've said that one of the biggest challenges that they've faced has been able to get traction outside Indonesia for support of a uniform recruitment system within Indonesia.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank you, Wayne. Look, I might hand it over to Sally now as our discussant, who will summarise some of the key themes and also talk a little bit about her research in this area. Thanks, Sally.
I can't unmute.
You're on.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody. The 3 really interesting presentations. And I really think that I can summarise adequately the entirety of those 3 presentations in 5 minutes. Or just a couple, so I'm just going to pick up on a couple of points to summarise. And the first one is that one thing that I noticed in listening to the presentations is that while anti-trafficking measures and responses to trafficking in the fisheries is really oriented mainly to the source countries, what's very clear, particularly from Jong Chul's presentation and Patricia's presentation, is that transit and port states are very much neglected in these discussions of responses. And clearly they play a crucial role, not just in terms of identification and initial protection and supports to trafficked fishers, but also in relation to things like remedial justice and criminal justice outside of the source states, which has very rarely occurred when we're dealing with the crime of trafficking, human trafficking of fishers. So I think further attention in responses and discussion about what's going on in transit and port states is very, very important to commence those discussions. Another thing that I wanted to pick up on is that from all 3 presentations, the insights that they have gained are primarily from talking directly and in detail with victims of trafficking in fisheries themselves. And as Patricia has rightly pointed out, no one goes to talk to the men. So we're just in the process of doing a pilot study in Indonesia with trafficked fishers who were involved in 2 legal cases a few years ago. And from the interviews that we have conducted so far, it's the same response. Nobody has ever talked to any of them about their experience either of trafficking or of safe repatriation or of their involvement in justice processes. So if we're talking about the links between action and gaps in responses and research, I think there are two clear messages here. One message is that it's really important to actually talk to victims and to make victims' voices, you know, a really central component of critically examining the gaps in responses to these issues. And the other thing is that there needs to be far more attention in terms of research to what goes on outside of source countries. And so fleet states and transit and port states should definitely be as equal a focus of attention. And I certainly know that from doing this research in Singapore, which is both a transit and a port state, where the Singapore government has chose to respond to this issue by creating almost like a holding area in the main fisheries port and deporting any fisherman who comes off the vessel and is in a state of distress and has a complaint. So there is no opportunity in a port state that has signed and ratified the UN Trafficking Protocol and has its own domestic legislation on the issue. There is no political will, and there is simply an effort to offshore and remove the problem back to the source countries. So clearly, you know, if I'm thinking about gaps and I'm thinking geographically and geopolitically, source states is important, but also what goes on beyond source states to look at ports and transits, I think, is crucial, and actually including victims' perspectives, not only in terms of narrating their own experiences, but in terms of their views about where there are gaps in these processes. So I'm going to leave it at that and make it short and sweet, just because I know that there seems to be a lot of other people who want to ask questions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, we have a few questions in the chat, but before I turn to the audience Q&A, we do have our three discussants, Wayne, Sunil and Christina. So I might ask them in that order to ask one of the panelists each one question. And so we'll do a round of questions before turning to the questions in the chat. So Wayne, Sunil, and then Christina.
Okay. So my question is for Bobby, and I'm interested to know a bit about what SPMI is doing for trafficked fishes once they've returned to Indonesia. Bobby mau tanya, SPMI lebih terlibat dengan penanganan kasus migran kalau masih bekerja di luar negeri. Kalau sudah dipulangkan ke Indonesia, apakah masih ada bantuan dari SPMI?
Ada. Jadi di Indonesia kami menuntut para perusahaan perekrut ABK itu untuk bertanggung jawab ya. Pertama melalui Badan Perlindungan Pekerja Migran Indonesia. Jika melalui proses mediasi tidak berhasil, kami biasanya melaporkannya dengan pidana, yaitu pidana perdagangan orang. Ada yang menang, ada yang juga kasusnya mandek di kepolisian. Yang menang di pengadilan itu hingga saat ini baru satu kasus ya yang mendapatkan restitusi, sementara yang lainnya tidak mendapatkan. Itu persoalan.
Okay, so Bobby says that that SPMI coordinates with a technical agency in Indonesia that handles issues to do with migrant workers. In the first instance, in the second instance, what they do is they coordinate with the Indonesian National Police to monitor how investigations are proceeding for under the trafficking law. What they've also noticed is that although the Indonesian law on anti-trafficking requires restitution to be paid to victims of trafficking, they've only noticed that the restitution has been paid to migrant fishers in one instance.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank you, Wayne. Sunil, did you have a response or a question to one of our panelists?
I did, yes. My question is to JC. Thank you for the wonderful and very informative presentation. I'm really interested in the prosecutor's side of things and your views on what you think are the key barriers that prosecutors face in the litigation processes in relation to both fishing companies and then individual traffickers themselves.
In the context of Korea, the authorities do not categorize, this the crime as the human trafficking, even though we ratified the human trafficking protocol. It is very hard to persuade the law enforcement officers, to approach this incident or crime as perspective of human trafficking, and that's why they always fail to identify the victim of human trafficking. And in the case of China, I believe Chinese government try to protect the fishing companies rather than showing any attempt to investigation of the allegation itself. That's why they totally denying what happened to the Longsing 629, even though we show the evidences shared by the victims, including the photos and videos, and so yeah, that is the main barriers I've felt in the middle of putting them into justice.
Thank you, JC. Christina, I might get you any thoughts, comments or questions for our panelists.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to our speakers for 3 very interesting presentations, discussions. I do have a question for Patricia. I actually have 2 questions. So I'm going to kind of encroach onto the questions in the chat because there's a very interesting question there. But first of all, Patricia, a very quick question. You talked about the Pacific Islanders working on these, the fishing vessels. Where are the vessels from? What flags do they fly?
Oh, most of them are the ones here, China and Taiwan, but some of them are Fijian flagged. But also, actually, some of the China and Taiwan ones, they're flagged to Vanuatu, which is a open access registry.
Yeah. Okay. So now, Beck, if I can ask Patricia one of the questions from the chat.
Go for it.
The question is, would you want to see each country implementing these laws, regulations, or would you like to see a compact introduced? So where there's a critical mass of countries all agree to implement the same law. So
Can I actually add to that? Whether this kind of compact could be a part of the Pacific Island Forum Blue Pacific or Blue Continent concept that they're developing at the moment?
I think that'd be, I haven't gone along that, but thank you. It's an interesting concept, Christina, and also Beck. The problem, like if I can just give an example, and I'm not very au fait with the port-state agreements. I apologise to that, but I think that I know at the moment a number of the Pacific Island countries are trying to sign on to this port-states, I forget what it's called, thing where they can check vessels. But what it might lead to, and so what it would lead to is to the vessels that didn't want to be checked, not going to those ports, obviously, but then they go to the other ports. And in the Pacific, very embarrassingly to say, we have 5 nations that have open registries. There's Vanuatu, there's Tuvalu, there's Nauru, there's Cook Islands, amazingly, it's a New Zealand protectorate. And the biggest one is the Marshall Islands. So if those countries are happy to have open registry where people basically flags of convenience, I don't see that they're going to join into a compact. So you'll end up again with the good guys all doing the right thing and the other ones, business as usual, just going in and out. And the other thing you'd have to remember is motherships, because the motherships or the reefers are sitting in the high seas pockets. And so even if you had, well, I suppose crews a bit different, but we know that goods go onto the motherships and so on. So it's a good idea, but I think that some of these penalties, like taking a vessel out of the fishery for a year or 6 months because of authenticated abuse of crew, would send a ripple through the whole community. So it'd either make them hide or run, or actually clean up their act. And I think interwoven with that is some of the issues that I said earlier. There's the value of the fishery. The Pacific Island fishery is worth something like $60 billion a year. And a lot of people shut their eyes. They don't want to look at these humble workers. We all know that. The other one is the geopolitical influence. Here in the Pacific, China is very, very powerful. And no one's listening to me, I hope, but Fiji, they've got Fiji on their knees, but you can rub that out of all translations, please, because I'm not a citizen yet. And so there's a lot of compromising things. It's a good idea. And it's something, I think, Beck, your point, it could be flagged if we could develop that coming through the commission. But the Foreign Fisheries Agency, for example, has a list of vessels of good standing. But we find that some of these vessels that we know have got very bad crew activities, they're on that list. So it seems to be a bit of whitewashing going on. And I think it all comes back to no one wants to look because of the value of the fishery, the dependence of the Pacific Island states to the fishery and to the money it brings in. And these people just fall through the cracks.
Thank you, Patricia. You've answered a couple of the questions in the chat, which is very useful. But I might, we've only got 3 minutes left, so I might ask one question for each of our panelists to consider, and that is if there is issues with prosecution and the sort of geopolitical issues that you mentioned, Patricia, what can individuals do in order to try to deal with this issue? So one of our questions is, to what extent does or could consumer boycotts affect change? So I might, if you can, our panelists keep to 1 minute to answer that question. I might start with you, JC. What can individuals or civil society do to help mitigate this issue?
Yeah, as you just mentioned, as a consumer, we can avoid, the purchase of tainted, fish, and also you can participate in petition. As we planning to launch the "Who Caught My Fish" campaign. Is for the Korean fishing authorities, but we can participate in the petition in various ways, I think.
Thank you. Very brief. Patricia, what are your thoughts? What can people more generally do?
Well, yeah, I agree with you. The consumer is very, very powerful. That's very strong. So I think there has to be a lot of media, and we know that WWF's had the odd campaign where they had tins of tuna categorized and so on. That had a big influence on some supermarkets, I believe, and so on. But I think also it's actually the NGOs actually telling the people about their rights. And it's hard when a lot of people are out of work and trying to find jobs. You know, we had one story where one fellow on a fishing vessel actually knew his rights. So he kept on arguing with the skipper, and the skipper just offloaded him in Hong Kong. He had a lot of trouble getting back.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, sadly, we are all out of time. We've had some terrific questions in the chat, and I apologise that we haven't been able to get to all of them, but I'm sure
Beck,
our audience agrees.
Just a minute. Beck, did you want to ask Bobby quickly?
Wayne, would you like to translate?
Ya, saya akan menjawab pertanyaan dari Mbak Siti Mas Sitoh ya. Ada saat ini dilakukan oleh pemerintah, misalnya sosialisasi kepada pemerintah daerah terkait dengan izin perusahaan yang bisa menempatkan pekerja migran Indonesia baik di seabase ataupun landbase ke luar negeri. Nah, tapi problemnya saat ini kami terhalang dengan adanya regulasi baru, yaitu Omnibus Law yang mengaburkan perizinan, sistem perizinan. Saat ini jadi di undang-undang yang terbaru, undang-undang perlindungan pekerja migran yang terbaru, perizinan itu ada pada satu kementerian, tetapi dengan terbitnya undang-undang Cipta Kerja Omnibus Law ini menjadi tidak jelas lagi. Kami belum mendapatkan penjelasan dari pemerintah siapa yang akan menerbitkan perizinan nanti. Kalau tidak jelas seperti ini, resikonya adalah seperti yang terjadi pada sebelum terbitnya Undang-Undang Perlindungan Pekerja Migran yang baru, yaitu perizinan itu ada di kementerian, kemudian ada di pemerintah pusat dan ada di pemerintah daerah. Itu persoalannya.
Okay, I'll just quickly translate. So Bobby said that one of the biggest things that they're noticing now is that they and other NGOs in Indonesia need to work more with local government to develop recruitment procedures. What they've also noticed is that the new law that was passed on job creation further complicates the situation. So it was already difficult, and now it's much more difficult. And they're still trying to navigate that difficult time.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank you, Wayne. So we really do have to wrap up now as we have gone past the hour, but just before we go, the poll results, 67% of participants said that Thailand was the fishing fleet that has come under the most criticism for seafood slavery, and that 67% is correct. So thank you so much for having us, and please do enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you.
Thank you for everyone for attending the Evidence to Action Summit and today's session. Please do join us at the other sessions during the summit throughout today and the next 2 days. All registered participants should have received calendar invites and a participant's guide to all the sessions of the summit. The next sessions today are titled Panel A, Sensitive Research and Data Collection, Learning Across Different Sectors, and Panel B, Gender-Based Violence in Migrant Communities. These will begin in approximately 2 hours. And please do continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams, especially if you are interested in finding collaborators for the pitch competition being offered through participation in the Evidence to Action Summit. Thank you again for your participation, and have a wonderful day.